Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. We are here to talk about playing well with others. This is creative user interaction in the JSS. And my name is Katie English. If we have not yet met, I'm a professional services engineer with Jamf Software. Been here almost 3 years. And there's a tiny math error on the JNUC event page. It says I've done 400 engagements. I've only done 318. I do apologize for the small discrepancy there. But I've been here, done this for a while. I've worked with a lot of different customers, a lot of different people. And sometimes they come up with strikingly similar requests, which is why I'm here to kind of show you some of the things that customers tend to ask for and give you some hints. There is a lot of code that you're going to be seeing on the screen here. Please don't fret about that. Please don't try to take notes. All of the code has been posted to the JNUC event page. You are free to download it and scroll along with me if you like. And afterwards, if you want to post questions on that event page, I'm happy to answer some additional questions at that point in time. So, playing well with others. We are going to start off with why do we need to be interactive? What are we trying to get out of our end users? What are our goals here? We've also got some tools, some decisions to make about how we present this information to our end users, how we elicit feedback. And then I've got some examples. And we start kind of in the least complex example. That's just a basic email from self-service. And then we're moving on to, this one gets a little bit more fun. This is a policy that pops up a dialogue in front of the end user that says, you have to do this. You have to do it by this date. And the relative date is actually an important notion there because we already have definite deferrals in the JSS. This one is relative. So we'll talk about saying this has to happen within 3 business days. Cool. And then the third example, this is about imaging and extension attributes. We're going to bump into the API here, and don't panic, because hopefully we can make that a little bit easier for you. I know a lot of people get a little skittish when we start talking about the API. So we're going to demystify that a little bit. I'm going to keep coming back to this. When we're being interactive with our end users, we have to keep some stuff in mind. We want to influence user behavior, but we don't want to bludgeon users. We want them to play nicely with us. We want them to come along on our self-service journey with us. We want them to submit tickets in a way that makes our lives easier and that makes it easier to do our job for them. But we have to be super careful how we do that, and we don't want to pop up dialog boxes all the time. Every single possible thing that an end user could be doing, we don't want to annoy them with it. So we got to be super careful about how we are approaching this particular challenge. And of course, one of the additional goals here is to make our lives as admins easier. If we can get an end user to behave in a way that saves us 5-6 steps in terms of logging particular activities or troubleshooting tickets or whatever, awesome. Then we've won that particular battle. And of course, if we can do our jobs more easily, we're more likely to do it more quickly, and end users are going to really love us. So we're going to talk about why how our different examples meet these individual goals as we go. When we do interactive stuff in the JSS, or with the JSS, with OS X, with scripting, with anything, we have a lot of tools at our disposal. You might recognize some of these icons. Jamf Helper, by the way, doesn't have an icon, so I just stole the generic JSS icon. But the notion is there. Jamf Helper. You might not even know it's there, but you can use it to pop up interactive dialogues. Coca Dialog, Platypus, show up in the top right. I love these tools. They are great. Xcode, I'm not very good at Xcode, but I've used it and sometimes actually generated a successful interface. Today, we're limiting our scope to something super basic, something that it will always be supported in the current version of the operating system. We don't have to worry about support lag as developers go off and do other things. And it's the lowly script editor with AppleScript. And it does get a shiny introduction because it actually can do a heck of a lot of stuff. So all of the example code that I posted on Jamf Nation is all written for script editor. You can launch it in your native application, and it's almost human readable. That's one of the benefits of your generic script editor here. So we start off with example 1. You can send an email from OS X by command line. You can do that. That's pretty straightforward. That's just a bash script. You just dump some text into mail and you send it, and it gets to the end user, presumably. But let's say you're a customer that I worked with, I don't know, earlier in the summer, and that customer said, I want to build out self-service. I want things to be better for end users. I want them to ask for my help in more standardized ways. I want them to be able to send an email that automatically goes into my ticketing queue and processes who they are, what computer they've sent the request from, and what they're asking me for. Okay, I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable. So we can use this basic idea and start kind of improvising off of it. So these are our policies. We take our uncompiled Apple script, which we're going to get to in a minute, and we just dump them straight into a policy action. These policy actions are available in self-service. They're available to all computers with one particular limitation in this case, because it had to be on the corporate network, and we're going to get to why that is. So we actually restricted the network access and said, only if you're on your internal IP addresses can you get to these policies. And this is what they look like in self-service. Pretty straightforward, pretty basic. I click a button. Then what happens? I get a dialog box. Please help me. And maybe we provide some prompts. Outlook, printing, Wi-Fi, these are very common issues, right? We can actually help our end users tell us what's wrong, and then we can reply back to them and ask for a bit more information. My Outlook's not working. Okay, tell me more. I get an error message every time I try to send a 50 megabyte attachment. Okay, they can tell us that, and then we can help them out. And then we can provide a little bit of end feedback. This is super, super easy in AppleScript. All we're doing is popping up dialog boxes. The text that our users are entering, we take that, we dump it back into a script, turn it into a variable, and we're going to see what happens to that variable coming up. But let's say we wanted to know some more information. So I'm an end user, I tell you my Outlook is broken. Cool. But who are you and where are you communicating to me from? We can use pretty simple shell scripting to return some identifying information about the computer or the person that is talking to us. This is just a quick system profiler script to return the serial number. Easy. We add that in. We don't have to ask the end user. We don't need to know who they are, because we found out. We know in our one-to-one environment that this user is assigned to this serial number. We could also, particularly in environments where we are bound to Active Directory, say, we could do a quick check to see who is the logged in user. If we return that information to say, I am logged in as the console user, and my AD credentials are katie.english, cool, we can steal that too. We don't have to ask our users for too much information. Tell me what's wrong. I already know who you are and where you're coming from. There's a little bit of a catch here. So I showed you earlier, there's a mail script, mail command line built into OS X. There's also send mail. These tools, they use postfix in the background. Now you can imagine that if someone were clever, they could use mail or send mail and start spewing spam across your network kind of at will, if you were allowed to do that. So we have to pause for a moment. Oops, let me back up. Did that come up? No. One more. There we go. On your managed devices, you have to configure postfix to be able to use an open relay. Now, this is where you make friends with your mail administrator, because even if you don't know it, there's probably a hidden mail relay on your network that's available for almost exactly this purpose, and or to send printouts, and or to send scans or faxes or whatever, make anonymous devices on the internet or on the corporate network be able to send notifications to administrators. So you got to find out what the name of your internal SMTP server is. You got to find out what the limitations are. There might be a limitation in terms of recipient and sender domain address. You have to be at a certain domain to be able to send to this address. You might have to be on an internal IP address. Remember earlier when I said we had to restrict those policies to internal corporate IPs. So in this particular case, for that particular customer, they had to instruct people to be on VPN in order to get access to the help desk options there. So we check with our mail administrator, we find out what this information is. You can write this information to postfix main.cf in a number of different ways. There are authenticated methods that you can use for like SMTP with Gmail, that kind of thing. Those things are published out on the internet, sort of beyond the purview of today. But basically, you have to choose a relay that can send your message. The bottom line there is a bit of gobbledygook, but it actually gets me out of a major problem, which is end users are expressive, and they use strange characters and things, exclamation points, because they're pissed and they're mad that things aren't working, and so they put in many extra characters just to tell me exactly how mad they are that things aren't working. So this script is a little way around that, because AppleScript has some challenges when it's working with quotation marks. Escaping all your quotes can break things. It's super complicated. To work around that, I just changed everything to alphanumeric. Skip all the special characters, just give me the text of what you said, move on with my life. It'll send, and I don't have to worry about escaping everything. So that's what that bottom thing is. Again, all commented in the code as provided. I'm not going to give you a quiz on sed later because I can't even pass that. So the result is a standardized email that can be parsed by a help ticketing system. It provides the serial number of the local computer. It provides the console user, which may or may not map to LDAP information that you already have. And it provides some amount of text that the end user has provided to say, hey, this is broken. Except it doesn't actually provide all that, because we removed all the alphanumeric characters. No periods, no exclamation points, no special characters. Just tell me what's wrong. As I said, we got to focus on our interactive goals. What do we get out of this? If I can point end users consistently to self-service and say, you have a problem, you're going to get faster service if you go here and click the button and tell me what's wrong. That way it can immediately go right into queue. We can assign it as we need to. We can help kind of train our users to help us help them better. Gets us more efficient as IT admins, and hopefully makes everybody happier in the process. So that's one really basic example. Real life, customer said, I want an email button, click it, something happens. In the example posted to Jamf Nation, there's also a different piece of code, basically a slight improvisation on this example, which is an end user requesting a license for a particular piece of software. I need a license for Adobe Creative Cloud. Click the button, it goes into queue, somebody turns it around and gives you the license code. So that's why there are two example codes in the example one stuff posted to Jamf Nation. Basically, one is one dialog box and one is two dialog boxes. Not much difference. All right. So that one's pretty straightforward. That one's almost like kind of the easy end. Things are going to get a little bit more interesting now. Relative deferral. This comes up from a very, very specific user case. This user says to me, we're changing our Active Directory. When that change happens for a particular end user ID, the information on the back end will actually break their 802.1x certificates. Therefore, this change has to happen while they are connected to the corporate network. You have to be physically wired to the network because we're going to break your Wi-Fi. And if we're going to deliver new profiles, you have to be on the network to do it. So this was well communicated to the end users within the company, but we needed to nag people a lot. And we needed to give people, according to the company policy, 3 business days. You have 3 business days to accomplish this. And then you no longer have a choice. You just have to do it. So let's talk a little bit about how we accomplish this. We've got some math being done in our post-flight script. Again, I'll post it on Jamf Nation. There's a little text file called post-flight, and you would wrap this into your package bundle, and it would happen at the very end of the package installation. The post-flight actually does a lot of math in terms of absolute time in Unix land, epoch time. When did this happen? I get 3 business days from the time the policy fired. Okay, so we can do some math on that. And then the relative deadline. If the policy happens today, Thursday afternoon, I get until, what is that, Tuesday afternoon at 5 p.m. So we have to include our weekends. This is a lot of very obscure math. Check it out on the example because the idea here is that we are offsetting by 3, so 3 business days, yeah. We are exempting ourselves on weekends because none of us work on weekends. And then we add in some additional time. And then we do yet more math and we return the relative deadline, the relative day, year, month. And then at the very bottom, that 1,770,000, that is 5 p.m. on the day of our final deadline. So if we've crossed that particular absolute time, we're past deadline. But this gives us the ability to do math later and say, I'm still under deadline or I'm beyond it. Cool. Then we dump that particular math piece that we've just done into a little file that just lives on the local hard drive. We can refer to it later. It's the .deadline file. We can read it later. It's just an integer, which means we can do math on it and say greater than or less than that integer. Cool. This is where cool stuff happens. When an end user gets a pop-up that says you have to click OK to continue with the policy. Oh, by the way, this is where they tell you end users don't have admin rights. Okay, so if I'm an end user and I click the button to run a policy, I do not want to be presented with a box that says enter administrator credentials to continue because I don't have them. And I'm not dragging this thing to the help desk to get that fixed. So the way around that is to use a launch daemon, which elevates us to root. If the script being called every 2 hours during business hours is being run as root, it pops up. When I, the end user, click the button to continue, I'm still using root privileges to continue the policy action. So the launch daemon is also packaged and distributed on JNUC, or on the JNUC website there. And this is the guts of it. Pretty straightforward. All it's doing is calling a script once an hour. So hourly check. I'm putting it in a mythical corp policy directory. You would want to rename that to something that's actually usable. It's going to start at the top of every hour. Once an hour, 8 a.m., 9 a.m. If I'm within business hours, I'm going to receive this pop-up notification because the script is going to run. Cool. So when the script runs, we're back to math. We're going to go get the timestamp that we wrote during the post-flight script to say, this is when the policy happened. And then I'm going to say, what time is it? Where I am. Local computer time right this second, because we all have laptops and we're all very mobile and we could be anywhere. But I only want it to happen during local business hours. So it does math and says, if the current local time is within business hours, then we're going to figure out down that bottom line, are we greater than or less than the timestamp that we left behind during the policy run? And then we present our users one of 2 different options. Deadline hasn't come up yet. Cool. We pop up a dialog that says, are you ready to do this? Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm in a meeting and I have no ability to connect to the physical corporate network like I'm supposed to, like a good user who does what I'm told. And maybe I have to wait. Yeah, I'll be there in 2 hours. So I say not now. Or I say proceed. And then it kicks off the policy as root, so I'm not asked for administrator credentials. Or we've exceeded the deadline. Now we have this nice modal dialogue that says, you don't get a choice. You don't get to defer. It needs to happen now. Now, of course, in the case of end user has to voluntarily take computer and plug it into another location, it's hard to force them to do that. But we've sort of kind of enforced the language here. We've taken away the ability to defer. Now we have this nice modal dialogue that is totally in their way. Hopefully, we can influence user behavior to get the desired result. Which leads me back to our goals. Influencing user behavior. How do we get them to play nice? Come take advantage of the prompt that's been very polite up until now and is going to get a little bit more insistent later. Initiate the policy that we've asked you to do. Take care of the migration on the back end and limit the number of physical interactions that IT has to do to catch up with everybody who didn't actually play nicely. So the relative deferral, it's all about math, and it's dreadful math. I've done it for you. You don't have to do it. You can offset it by however many days you want. You can also change the scripting actions so that maybe it happens every hour on the hour, not just during business hours, or maybe your business hours are different than the ones I've documented. One final example, and this is one I actually wrote as a customer. I worked in higher ed, and I managed labs of Macs, several hundred Macs across multiple campuses, and I was the admin, and I very rarely left my desk because that's the treat of being the admin, and so we had operational users out in the world doing all of the heavy lifting. And they would periodically reimage computers. And we needed to know when that happened. We needed to know who did it. And sometimes we needed to know why. So I have to give you a very big caveat to this particular workflow. It worked great up until 9.7.2. Small problem. Discovered that this week, and I filed a defect about it. But the idea here is we're writing to an extension attribute in a computer record. And the problem is that a subsequent enrollment action actually blanks out those text and pop-up extension attributes. That'll be corrected right this second, 9.7.2 and previous. The workflow is still valid though, because we're still, in this case, we're not actually asking end users to reduce friction. We're asking our internal IT users to provide us some more information. We need to know who's doing what and when. Cool. And it's just an extension attribute. In this case, it's going to be the imager name. Could be a date. It could be the imager's boss. It could be a lot of other things. So extension attributes, of course, are just custom fields that we can use for whatever we need. And in this particular case, we're asking people to populate them for us. And we're going to bump into the API a little bit. Should be pretty cool. We're going to start off with an extension attribute, just a custom field. In this case, it's just a text field. That's all it is. Tell me the imaging user, the person who imaged the computer. You can populate this manually just like any other extension attribute, but for our purposes, we're going to have that done by script. We start setting up some interesting loops in the scripting process. First, we start off with, what computer is this? And of course, as we know, in version 9, the unique identifier of the computer is the UDID, and that's how we get this. And that's the AppleScript way of doing it. We're just going to run a quick shell script to do IOReg and return the UDID. Perfect. Variable done. Great. And then we start an authentication check. So this is a dialog that pops up to our end user, the imaging user. We are asked to authenticate. Now, the imaging user is going to have particular privileges to the JSS. They're going to have create, read, and update privileges, and potentially imaging privileges as well if you want them to launch Casper imaging at the end of the process. So I enter my username. Maybe it's a local username in the JSS. Maybe it's an LDAP credential because I'm part of a group that has those permissions. In any case, get the password. The result actually does something kind of cool here. So it actually sends those credentials up to the JSS with an API call using curl. And what we're using is the UDID, the unique identifier of the computer that I'm running on right that second, to say, hey, here's this MacBook. JSS, do you know this MacBook? And the JSS says, hang on, I need credentials. So we have that, and that's in the imager name and passphrase that we actually entered in during those dialog boxes. And then we return the XML that comes back. When we do that, a lot of very tiny text here. I do apologize for that. But we can look at the text that comes back, and we know instantly this is a known device, or that user didn't authenticate correctly. I don't know who you are. You do not have authorization to do what you just did. The result coming back from the JSS, we can parse it. We can say, cool, device is known, user is known, or user is known, device is not known. This is all just a bunch of logic checking loops. Nothing terribly special. It just looks impressive. It's kind of why I copied and pasted it. So we can do quick shell script, a grep against the XML that we downloaded. This hardware was not found. It was not located in the JSS. This is new. Very cool. So now we can actually, we can also read if the device was already found. We can actually parse the XML. You might not know this. AppleScript has a really competent XML parser built in. So you can actually find the element of a particular subset of elements and report that back as a variable. If the computer already existed in the JSS, AppleScript can tell you what the computer name was. Cool, we can use that. We have some contingencies to plan for. Either the hardware is new, brand new, or it's already known and we're leaving it as is. Maybe we're just re-imaging it because, hey, I run a computer lab and these computers get re-imaged all the time. Or the hardware already exists in the JSS, but it's being renamed. We stuck a new asset tag on it, something like that. Some values are changing. These are our different contingencies to accommodate. And so we pop up a dialog to the end user to confirm. Hey, using that information that we just parsed out of XML, based on the UDID that we flung up at the JSS and the JSS replied, based on that information, is this cool? Are we right? Is the computer named this? Is that the asset tag? Yes or no? We're stuck in another loop until the end user says yes. If the end user says no, then we can change our values. No problem. The output of this, we dump into another XML file. We pulled one from the JSS about our computer record. We're writing another one right now. XML is almost human readable, right? These key values are pretty understandable. And we've got computer in general and computer name. And hey, look at that variable right there. You'll notice this is actually how AppleScript has to parse variables. So we have name, closing the tag, and then the quotes, and then an ampersand, and then the actual variable name, another ampersand, quotes, and then the end of the tag. So we take the computer name that either was provided by the JSS itself or by the end user, we dump it into XML. And we're just writing this out to a local value. Same with the UDID, unique identifier, super important. Asset tag, just as an example. Maybe you guys don't care about asset tags. You can ignore that. That's the cool part. We're only worried about the values that we're modifying or changing. A few more values here, including, hey, that imaging user, the person who originally logged in, the person whose credentials that we used to actually get the original XML value, we grabbed that. We wrote it into our new XML, which means we can upload it to the JSS via post, and now we have that information captured. Then Casper Imaging launches, and we know who did it. We know maybe when they did it. There's some other interesting ideas here. What else can we do with this stuff? Have a large multinational company who, they have a loaner program. And when loaner devices are provisioned, they have to capture who provisioned it and for whom, but also who that person's boss is, because that person is the person who signs the paperwork to say, yes, we will return this piece of hardware. Cool. Capture that information too. You can actually throw that against an LDAP search and verify, yes, that is a real person, and yes, that person is in the same organizational unit as the other person. So we can actually build in some additional complexity there. For their loaner program, we also set up basically date thresholds to say the loaner begins today, it ends next month. Produce date values, put those into extension attributes in the JSS, and use smart groups to populate them later. It's all just math. Show me every loaner that expired 2 weeks ago. Smart group, no problem. Once again, we're back to our goals. In this particular case, the end user is not an end user with using the computer day-to-day. This is an imaging user. This is somebody who works in IT. When I was an admin in higher ed, the whole point of this was to reduce friction with the Windows team, because they would get very cranky if a Mac was built with a name and AD that should have been assigned to a Windows device because it screwed up all their scripts. And so to make my life easier, because I didn't like getting yelled at by the Windows admin, I started writing this stuff to do validation checks to make sure we're not wandering out of the prescribed values that Macs can have in this particular organization. We also have accountability built in. If these are LDAP users, we know LDAP credentials were used to image this computer. Maybe we don't know why, but we can find the person and find out. We can find out when these things happen. And it's not just imaging. This is not restricted to only a pre-imaging workflow. This could be done by self-service after the fact. You could use this script as a self-service option so that end users who had their machines shipped to them can actually type in the asset tag number themselves. So we can adapt these workflows for just about any old thing. And the whole idea here is to use the XML and actually retrieve that information either reliably from the end user or from the computer itself, and just send that up in a standardized format to the JSS. Those are my examples. Again, all the code is on Jamf Nation. Read it over. Feel free, please, to start some conversations. If any of that stuff doesn't make sense, I promise I commented it heavily, so you should be able to kind of dissect what each component's doing. But I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Katie, in your try loop, how do you handle a timeout? Or do you worry about it?
Give me an example of which try loop we're doing.
Say your user, is this asset tag correct, yes or no?
Okay.
And you sort of walk away and have a coffee or something.
Okay, so the question is if in the middle of soliciting user feedback, the user goes bye-bye and doesn't provide feedback. In this particular case, I think the way I would deal with that is just leave it there and possibly maybe also caffeinate the process so the computer doesn't go to sleep and maybe lose network connection. But those are all modifications you can make. Just having it sit there in front of the user, when they come back, they might be able to type that information in. Yeah? Up front.
Your script that accounted for work days, one thing it left out was holidays. Is there any library or some sort of routines that are aware of holidays?
I'm sure there are. The question is, the script for business days did not account for holidays. I'm sure you could write that in as a condition to say if the date is 25 December, move on. I think that's probably pretty straightforward to do. But are there known libraries of that? I think that would vary by country, right? So I'm sure you could construct that. Yeah? Removal, okay, so the question is, with re-imaging, can you use that to remove the old name? Yes is the short answer. You could also just overwrite with the new name. Does that accomplish what you need? Yeah, so if you're doing a put action or a post uploading in place, it'll actually take the information in the XML that you're uploading in and overwrite anything that's there currently. So the old imaging user, bye-bye. We now have the new imaging user. Go. Yeah.
On that third example, how was your whole workflow triggered? Is it Casper imaging launches you had to trigger somehow?
Okay, so the question is on the third example, which is the imaging workflow, what actually triggered it? And so to give you a kind of a full picture of what happened in this particular case, operational imaging user walks into a lab with a pocket full of flash drives. They boot, because we weren't allowed to do netboot in that particular environment, never made friends with our network admins in that way. So boot from a local boot source. And in that particular case, it auto-logged in as root. I mean, this might all sound familiar if you've ever done a netboot workflow. Auto-launched the little script sitting on the desktop, or they could actually launch it themselves. At the end, and you'll see it in the code example, it tries to launch Casper imaging. And so also in that environment, we relied heavily on auto-run data. So computers were already known, and they already were set to behave a particular way during the imaging process, which, again, sort of reduced that friction. Operational users don't have that many buttons to click. There are fewer mistakes to make. You type in your credentials, you confirm the machine name, you hit go, Everything else just happens. They walk off to the next computer, and when the computer restarts, they yank the flash drive and move on to the next computer. Does that address your question? Cool. Yeah?
Out of all of the examples that you gave of different pop-up dialogue methodologies, like dialogue and everything, is there one that you prefer personally more than the other?
So the question is, what's my preference as far as the UI creation tool? I love Pashwa. It's a great tool, and it has a very low barrier to entry. It actually comes with really solid examples that you can just sort of improvise off of. That being said, I know that it's almost a religious preference. If you ask on Jamf Nation, there are a lot of opinions about it, and people love Cocoa Dialog. They love whatever. You know, there are a lot of options. I standardized on Script Editor, and I know it's almost a cop-out because it's boring, right? But it's built in. You already have it. You don't have to download it from anybody. Yeah?
As a follow-up to this gentleman about just someone walking away, besides caffeinating it, you could probably be really nasty and have it stay on top of all windows. And then that would really annoy them to the point that it would probably just make them quit.
So as an addendum over here, if you needed to annoy end users to actually do your bidding, besides caffeinating the dialog box so that it stays awake, you could also just have it be modal on top of absolutely everything. Can't do anything else until you continue.
Of course, they could just type get lost as your ASCII tag.
They could provide some feedback that might not be super helpful. Yeah?
Just looking at the example scripts, they don't have shebangs or anything on them. Will Casper inherently realize, oh, this is an Apple script based on this?
Really good question. So the provided examples are uncompiled AppleScript, and they do not have an interpreter written up into the top, as you've noticed. There's no shebang because it's AppleScript. So it's uncompiled AppleScript. You can drag and drop it into Casper Admin. You may or may not be able to edit it in line in the JSS browser, but it is just easy enough to drag and drop. You can edit it in line? Cool, easy. So yeah, uncompiled AppleScript should work native.
Avoids also the environmental funsies that sometimes make you use so much CTL, ES, etc.
Yeah, you shouldn't have any shell issues at all. Yeah, yeah, built-in native. Yeah.
You had alluded to methods within AppleScript that made it easy for you to parse XML. What are you referring to?
Oh, goodness. Let me see if I can go back and find those. Basically, you just tell AppleScript to find an element and read it back to you. Let's just pass this. Sorry. So the question was, how do we use AppleScript to actually retrieve the XML elements? And so, as I find that, come on now. It's one of these slides. I apologize. It is in here, and basically the idea is it's just get element of in element of. I mean, it's just basically a recursive loop to find it. Where is it? I promise it's in here.
Are you referring to the method used to read the aggregate keyless file?
I guess so. Probably the same. Yeah. So it would be equivalent to reading the values of here we go. Yeah, there it is. Value of XML element name. So it's just you start at the bottom and list the elements above it. So in this particular case, the XML reads, let's see, it would be computer, general, and then name. And so we're retrieving the value of the name key. Yep. Yeah.
Doing something similar, we found a bug to just be concerned about that if you have when Casper's starting up, when the machine's starting up and you get the black screen that says checked for policies, we had a pop-up Cocoa dialog box, but it didn't seem to matter because it had to do with file vault. The machine is file vaulted and you get the full screen Jamf helper. And you also display a pop-up waiting for response. response, it's below the Jamf helper window.
Good to know.
Which you can't click on.
So if you are mixing your different UI presentations, in this case, you might have Jamf Helper in full screen and then also Cocoa Dialog on, not on top. It would actually show up behind the full screen, which could prevent an end user from taking the action that would clear the full screen, right?
Well, yeah, in this case, it only mattered if it was 502, and because you don't have a choice with Jamf Helper, because
Right.
it's taking over the full screen, you can never get to the OK box, and thus it stays in a loop, and you can never hit OK, so you're forced to SSH in and kill Cocoa Dialog.
So if you're using Jamf Helper in full screen, be super careful, practice with it. You might also be able to do a command Q depending on how it was launched.
It's at startup, and
Okay,
so we had the checkbox checked to run this policy, this reminder policy at startup,
gotcha.
or at login, I'm sorry, at login.
Okay,
So,
okay. So yeah, we do have to be careful about how the layers of which we're presenting our interaction. That's good to know. Yeah?
This might just be a semantic question. Is there a reason why you use AppleScript calling shell script instead of shell scripts calling AppleScript?
Is there a reason why I used AppleScript calling shell script instead of the other way around? No. Mostly because AppleScript is a little bit friendlier, and I think the variables are a little bit easier to follow, especially for kind of like if this is your first exposure to it. So I guess it was a choice, but yes, absolutely, you can do AppleScript dialogues via OSA script via a typical shell script, absolutely.
I was just curious if anything JSS from the client side.
No system issues, just kind of a general user choice, yeah.
Wouldn't AppleScript have a built-in timeout that you have to ignore in order for?
Is it 5 minutes? Built-in timeout? So if a dialog pops up and we're ignoring it? Okay.
I actually put a 24-hour timer so technicians would start things and just walk away for hours.
Okay.
Your example of having a prompt just sit there indefinitely, it would actually time out usually if you didn't have it encoded.
Fair enough. So the point is that AppleScript has a built-in timeout, and so the prompt that's sitting there nagging the end user would go away on its own. Some might argue that's actually okay, because it's going to come up again in an hour anyway. So, yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, Bill.
Just to add to that, you can extend that timeout, say what timeout of seconds. And if you expect that the user's not there during the time pops up, you can say give me a path.
Yeah, okay. So you can both extend the timeout and then also just tell it to stop. Okay? Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. Let me know if you have any questions on the Jamf Nation site. Really appreciate your time and attention, and thanks for coming, guys.